Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. So today we're meeting with Bernadette Dancy, who studied psychology and did her PhD in stress and is now a health coach. So welcome, Bernadette. It's very good of you to come along.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's always great to meet people who want to have kind of conversations around the type of work that I do. So yeah, it's a pleasure.
Hi, good to see you again, Bernie. And I suppose I was keen to get you on the podcast because I realised when I was listening to you at an event that people talk about stress all the time. And it's one of those phrases that just gets bandied around in conversation. I'm so stressed. And listening to you and your research on stress made me think it would be good to have a deeper conversation about it. But I just wondered to kick us off if you could describe what stress is and identify the symptoms for us so that people listening know precisely what it is we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think we make huge assumptions that we do know what stress is because you're right, we say all the time, and it's definitely a bone of contention for me because I think by getting it wrong, we create kind of a stigma and misunderstanding about how to manage it and how to cope with it. So it really kind of depends on who you ask. So obviously, my background being in psychology, by definition, throughout my PhD and learning that approach to psychology, the definition of stress would be around this a perception of our lack of control. So perceived lack of control or uncertainty around situations that might pose as being a threat or a challenge to us. So it's from the world of psychology, it's kind of a conscious awareness that we have this kind of slight moment or opportunity to make a judgment about what's about to happen to us or what might be presented to us. And we therefore feel something that we may have an emotional response or a reaction to that situation. If you talk to a physiologist or a sociologist, they may give you a different definition. And in the world of physiology, I guess for me, I like the body-mind approach because we can't separate the body and the mind. And so when we look at stress and its origins and we look at its first kind of the founding fathers of stress, it was very much a physiological entity, which basically means that stress is regarded as a state or a response to, again, threat or danger or harm, which then brings about subsequent responses within the body. So different systems across the body. So the nervous system will respond, the digestive system, the immune system, the cardiovascular system, all in an attempt to try and protect us from whatever that threat or danger is. So in the line of work I do, I use both definitions because I think it's fundamentally impossible to separate the two. Yeah.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time in the dentist this week, and obviously that is a stressful situation. But there's something additional that what they do is they put water in your mouth and then drain it. But at times it feels like one's about to drown. And so I was aware of experiencing panic. So is there a very close relationship between stress and panic, would you say?
Yeah, panic is just a manifestation of stress, the stress response. So if you think about what's happening to you, there's a potential threat of drowning, and the body and the brain specifically will just take information from your environment, and it happens in milliseconds. We need it to do that for us to survive, right? So within milliseconds of your brain detecting a threat to your airway, be that water, and it's there for a purpose, which is to help you. The dentist knows what they're doing. That will set off a trigger or an alarm in your brain. So the fear center specifically within your brain, called the amygdala, will pick up on that within milliseconds. And you potentially might not even have perceived that threat before it even happens. And that will stimulate a cascade of reactions and responses within your body. So which can be, muscular, neuromuscular, to move away from the threat, to close your mouth, push somebody away. But also then there's a period of time within there cognitively we try to make sense of that. So there may be that the brain wants to understand what's happening, and it may be that it's attached to a previous memory, maybe as a child where you were exposed to water or a near drowning experience or something like that. So the panic response it's actually a helpful response to move us away from a threat potentially. It can only it becomes debilitating then if it doesn't finish, it doesn't complete, and there's no end to it. So we get stuck in panic, and that's where, say, a panic attack can happen. And therefore, all the symptoms seem so overwhelming that the fight or flight response remains activated and dominant. And that can feel really life-threatening. That can feel like everything's shutting down, which is quite a scary experience. So, yes, panic would be a manifestation of an acute stress response, but it can also be a manifestation of chronic stress or PTSD. So any trigger that may link to a potential threat, can initiate that panic response.
Thank you. Sorry, Naomi.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So, Bernie, you identified, I suppose, a number of bodily systems that are impacted on. Do we all experience stress in the same way, or are we all having the same physiological response to stress, or is it just that some of us notice our stomachs rather than our hearts, for instance? What's are we all the same?
Fundamentally, we are. Like, fundamentally, if you take a biological perspective approach to it, it's actually quite a straightforward, simple process. When you map it out and you look at what is happening, the beauty of it is that it's quite straightforward, in which case it's we're quite capable of coping and undoing that response. So, it's very linear, it's very predictable almost in a way. And so the responses that we have, the symptoms that we have, will be very kind of logical, in the sense that we'll have a cardiovascular response straight away, because we want to increase our blood pressure, we want to increase our heart rate, we want to increase the oxygen available to the working muscles to get us away from a danger. So we will notice increase in breathing, increase in heart rate, increase in maybe sweating or perspiration to get the adrenaline to where it needs to go. And then after that, the stress response kind of slows down. So then it can go on for minutes, where then cortisol takes over. So initially it's adrenaline and we need that response. And then cortisol, the hormones released from the adrenal glands, will kick in. And the degree to which like you were saying, different people notice those stress symptoms can really vary for multiple reasons. Heightened sensitivity to stress response. So certain individuals may have, unfortunately, experienced trauma, as we just kind of briefly intimated to, in which case they're going to have the neural pathways in the brain are almost more active and switched on to be alert to that. So those people may be more attuned to or aware of the earlier symptoms of stress, so panic, breathing, heart rate, etc. And therefore, for them, that might be something they notice on a frequent basis. The other thing that happens is the more kind of delayed response, which we, like, for example, where I talk about cortisol. This is a very simplified explanation, but for example, if you think about cortisol, we give it a really bad press, right? Cortisol is the stress hormone, but actually we need it. It's a necessary hormone, and its primary role is to facilitate the release of energy for us to survive. So if that stress response pursued or continued, cortisol would recognize that we need energy to move away from that threat, and it would release stored carbohydrate in the form of glycogen. And to do that, there's lots of processes that happen, but it happens relatively quickly. And that means it needs to shut down certain processes, such as digestion. And so the removal of blood from the digestive system, for example, will maybe give somebody the sensation of butterflies or nausea. It will shut down our continence. So it may encourage us to empty our bowels or to have a wee. So somebody might notice, oh, I'm nervous or I'm stressed. Actually, I need to wee more often. So it kind of depends on where you are. And then you have like a multitude of reasons why, from a neurodevelopment point of view, people might feel differently. So neurodivergent individuals, for example, may have trouble or have differences, should we say, with regards to what we call neuroception. So receiving that information from the body about threats such as temperature changes or bathroom or hunger cues. So whilst fundamentally the process is almost identical for all of us, our lived experiences, our life experiences, our exposure to stress can change the way we look at it. And when we look at learned experiences, that can sometimes be down to something called appraisal. So how we appraise that situation. If both of us can be in the same situation, I might appraise it or judge it, in other words, to be a challenge. And so I might not recognize some of the early signs of symptoms, whereas somebody else might see it as a threat. So our cognitive appraisal processes lets us to think about, well, how threatening is this, can also affect how much stress we feel in our body. So it's really fascinating how different it can be. Yeah.
And you spoke of it really being about a perceived lack of control. And what does that tell us about the evolutionary point to stress?
Yeah. So when you look at evolutionary, what is stress about? Why do we have it? It's our primary safeguarding process for survival. Like if we didn't have stress response, we wouldn't have evolved to be who we are, where we are for today. And so if you think about that from that point of view, the more control we have, or perceived control we have, the more information we have about the next step. So if we're going into a novel or new environment or a new situation, we might feel that we have less control over where to go, what to do, what to say, who to speak to, what's expected of us. And so we have to then rely on being able to react. And that makes us feel uncomfortable because then our threat centers are switched on. It's looking for potential threats. Whereas if we have control and we feel like we have reserves and resources ready at hand, I've been in this situation before, I know how to speak to these people, I have met this kind of challenge before, and I know I do X, Y, and Z, that could potentially work. Well, we are more likely to be in what we call the prefrontal cortex of our brain. So we're more likely to be in the part of our brain which allows us to make logical or rational decisions, as opposed to more emotional or responsive, reactive decisions. So if you think about it from an evolutionary point of view, well, that allows us to evolve because we have more opportunity to think logically, rationally, plan, make executive decisions, all really important skills that we need to find food or to make more money or to find relationships, etc. So it's not to demonize the kind of emotional kind of part of our brain. We really do need that. But to cope better with stress, all of the work I've done in terms of research throughout my PhD, but even with clients I work with on a daily basis, we can drill right down as why is that person stressed. Quite often it's this sense of feeling out of control. Yeah, fundamentally feeling like they haven't got full volition over what's happening and unfolding in their lives.
Thank you. And where did your interest in stress come from? Why did you choose this subject for your PhD?
I kind of didn't. I was kind of thrust upon me, except to say that I've always been fascinated with stress, I think. I was very lucky, I guess, in a way that I finished my undergraduate dissertation. And at that time, my supervisor had a PhD that she wanted to be researched and invited me to interview for that role. And I think it was at a point in my life where I was looking for that next challenge, and weirdly was somebody who always pursued a stressful situation. And I would deem it as challenge. So I always kind of went after high challenging situations to put myself out of my comfort zone. And I was that kind of individual. And I always kind of thought well, why not? And I was fascinated because my undergraduate degree was human biology and sports science. And the human biology was a joint honours degree. So I was equal. I could never pull myself in either direction. I was always fascinated by both because I really had this thing where I wanted to understand people, and I wanted to understand, more importantly, what is it that makes the difference? What is it that allows some people to thrive and just cope incredibly well, especially under really challenging circumstances? And I really was fascinated by that. So when the opportunity came up to do a PhD, and it was sort of tentatively in that realm, so it was looking at investigating stress, but looking at lack of control and perceived uncertainty in a specific population in sports psychology, which sounds very niche, and it is. They were the phenomenon of the substitute in professional football, the super sub. And so, fans looking back maybe remember like the Ole Gunnar Solskjaers of the world, and I think it was a guy called Fairclough, and lots of people early on. And if you look at the big picture and you think, well, that's, what's that got to do with life or anything? But actually, when you nail into this, like drill into the psychology of it, I found that really fascinating. You take an individual who's been given like really disappointing news or information, who's in a highly visible situation where everybody's watching them and everybody can see that they've then been given the information that they're not good enough. And yet the contradiction of terms is that they're then expected to then be the savior. So how do you, in that mindset, go from kind of being on your knees to potentially turning something around? And we're talking big money in those businesses, right? It's sport, but fundamentally it can turn companies and organizations millions of pounds. And I always found that interesting. So that's where my PhD took me. But the theories behind it, the psychology behind it, was very much about control, self-presentation, uncertainty, and how we appraise that situation. What was the difference between one individual who shared with me he was dropped as a substitute in the semi-final of the FA Cup, on the morning of the FA Cup. He was given that news. He thought he was playing, he was dropped. He said he trashed the changing room, and he turned the changing room over, and he was renowned for this kind of behavior, so it was kind of accepted because he was so disappointed, and he couldn't bring himself around, turn it around. Even when he got on the pitch and he was asked to go and play, he was still in that mindset. So for me, what's the difference between him and then somebody like, say, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer could come on in 3 minutes, potentially help the whole team win the Champions League? And it was the subtleties of their appraisal of that situation, their emotional intelligence, their ability to cope. Lots of information, lots of things around the communication with the coaches. So communication about how we receive information, how we share information, how we process information. So from a psychology point of view, I just found that really fascinating and interesting, because it lends, even now today, I still use information from that with clients I work with.
So can you tell us just a little bit more detail about what you found through doing that research?
Yeah. I think it was definitely an eye-opener how little preparation and communication there was for those individuals, given the responsibility they were under, given the potential for them to then have such a huge and significant impact, that how badly treated they were in the first instance. So that first initial contact or communication, and a lot of the time they weren't given any information. There was no communication or feedback, or sometimes it was about their previous performance, sometimes it wasn't. It was just a big of a picture. So I think communication became very transparent, and again, links back into the sense of lack of control. So this sudden information that we feel like the rug's been pulled from beneath us. We think certain things are going to pan out in a certain way, and then it's taken away. So there's a shock factor and a lack of control, which then triggers within the stress response this perception of threat and judgment around self-presentation. So self-preservation, self-presentation of ego, of what do people think of me? And I'm on this kind of arena and this stage. So there's a huge potential for that collapse of self-confidence and self-presentation. That was really interesting. And then it was the appraisal element. So those who appraised that situation in a positive light, who were able to take that information, pause, and to reevaluate it as being a challenge as opposed to a threat, were the ones who were then able to use the time that they were on the bench in such a productive way. So the whole time they were more present, which would link back to the being in the prefrontal cortex, the more logical, rational thinking brain. So they sat there and they thought, okay, that's happened. I'm now here. And now what? And it was very much like they watched the game. They studied what was happening, and they took the information and tried to use it to their advantage, so that if and when they got their opportunity, they knew they were at advantage. They had fresh legs. They had studied the form, the game. They had information from the coaches. And within that situation, they only could be a hero. If they didn't do anything to change the game, no one would probably remember anyway. But actually, they had the huge potential to go in and have such good impact and potentially be a hero. So their ability to see it as a challenge, it gave them that edge to then be present and manage their emotions better. So that was really interesting, and a lovely insight into how we can, take information and just change it, just simply by the way we perceive it and then what we expect of ourselves. And that internally, I didn't go down this route with my PhD, and I think it would definitely, some research that should be pursued, because it did kind of come up, was how they then physiologically prepared. And it was interesting, towards the end of my PhD, it started to see this in rugby specifically, that substitutes would sit on the sideline on exercise bikes. And you may have seen this if you watch professional rugby or international rugby. They will sit and they will warm up. You didn't see that so much in professional football, meaning they were trying to maintain a level of activation and what we call arousal in sport. So that sweet spot. And if you think about stress, and some theorists around polyvagal theory, we talk about being in that window of tolerance. So not too aroused where we get over emotional, and not under aroused where we've depressed or shut down. We can use the physiology and the nervous system to our advantage. So yeah, it's a micro niche kind of area, but it really lends to the great public, and just to jobs and life and stress that we all face, really, I think.
Yeah, really good to hear that kind of like real world example of when that's very much come into play. I remember that whole notion of the super sub, and the fact that people do come on and do these amazing things. Well, he was particularly notorious, wasn't he, for managing to do that. Did your academic studies help you deal with your own stress more effectively, do you think?
Yeah, I think for me, like, I grew up in a working class background. I was the first in my family to go to university. I remember telling my parents, I grew up in Dublin, and I knew I wanted to go to study in London, Twickenham, St Mary's in Twickenham, and I went there and I got in. In fact, I wanted to study human biology, and I remember I had to work really, really hard to get the grades to get in, and I got them. And I remember having that conversation to say, well, I'm going to London, and they were kind of like shocked. Really? And I'm like, well, yeah. And so I was always kind of academic, and I think having that mindset, pursuing, as I said earlier, kind of challenging situations, especially when you're not expected to, you're sort of not quite the underdog, but it's not expected of you, was always a really nice exposure to what some people might term good stress, that you're in those environments where you can then stretch yourself, and you come across failure and disappointment in academia. And I think you learn the hard way. I think my PhD was a baptism of fire as well, because I've never experienced anything more intense than my PhD viva. 4 or 5 hours of being absolutely grilled, and you walk out thinking I've failed, like, because they give you such a, well, from my experience, I had such a hard time. And then when they told me, I just remember the exhaustion of, oh God, okay, I didn't see that coming. So that, the irony of all ironies, the stress I experienced in that. So I think those experiences of striving and exposing yourself to high risk situations, but also potential for huge reward as well. It did teach me a lot about life, and it taught me resilience, I think. I think working in the world of academia was a huge learning curve. Again, I always felt like I didn't belong, like it was a different world. I didn't quite fit into that environment. But I think when you look at the world of academia, it's quite cutthroat, and it has to be in a way, because it's, as academics, we're constantly criticizing literature and research. And so the dialogue and the narrative is always, oh, that's good, however, so you're always like exposing yourself to being criticized and to being in a positive way. So that world, that environment, it can be a difficult one to work in. And I think after a while, for me, I found that, yeah, it wasn't for me, but it definitely taught me a lot about life and stress, for sure. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Bernie. That's so clear. I have to say that I remember that 1999 final so clearly that I still get a huge rush of emotion whenever it's mentioned. So, I'm having to struggle to focus right now. But tell us, why is stress at work so often mentioned as a problem these days?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I think about it a lot when I do in corporate talks and corporate work. It's such a hard question to answer, because the culture and the climate of work is always evolving. And if you just think back to pre-lockdown, what happened and how workplaces have evolved and been forced to change a lot for good in many situations, but also not so good in many as well. I think it's hard to pinpoint, because if you look at every generation, there have been situations, economic, industrial, cultural changes that have happened that people have come up against. So then you start to think, is this generation or this current climate any different? Are we just currently facing what all previous generations have had? I was a child of the 80s. I remember my parents struggling through the 80s, and recent recessions as well. And I'm a parent now, and cost of living is intense. So I think we're always going to be faced with certain levels of challenges in our working world. But that said, I think with the kind of speed at which things like, technology has evolved, I don't think we've quite caught up. I think we're still so juvenile, especially my generation. Like, I like to think I'm like cool and hip and I know what's going on. Half the time I'm like, AI what? Things are moving at such a rapid pace, and the expectation of workplaces I've seen drastically change. The demands of the generations that are up and coming. I think the funding behind paid roles is limited. People are being asked to do a lot more for their salaries. I've worked in organizations and seen where cutbacks have happened, and we see lines of middle management being removed, and therefore where does that work go? It just gets dripped down and spread out amongst people. So I think the demands and expectations within roles are really, really high. And I think that is a huge political problem. I think there's not much difference across industries. Obviously, I think civil service type roles are even more stretched. We only have to look in the prison service and the NHS and in teaching and academia. My husband is a university lecturer, and of course I've worked in that industry. So I've seen lots of evolutions of cutbacks and redundancies over the years. And I think it's this squeeze that's constantly put on people, which is overwhelming. And if you look at the data, the numbers are wide and varied. Pick any stat. There's statistics that say at least up to 75% of people report experiencing stress to the point of feeling overwhelmed in the workplace. Up to 50% of those people who are signed off from work is related to stress, and that includes anxiety and depression. So if we think about that, the percentages are high, and they're only going up ever since lockdown. The numbers are ever increasing. Workplaces have some and a significant responsibility for that, I do think, but I think also individuals ourselves, we do. And this is a hard sell when I talk about this, because I think I don't want organizations to then point the finger and blame individuals, because it's a very easy thing to do, but actually we have human beings showing up to workplaces. We're not robots. We turn up with our hearts on our sleeves, our emotions, maybe we're parents, maybe we're caregivers, maybe we're chronically ill, maybe we've got emotional illness, mental illness, physical illnesses. So we're bringing a lot to that paid role. And I think what we haven't got are the skill sets necessarily to deal with that level of stress. I think looking at myself, like I burnt out when I was 36, is why I left academia. And even within the role I was performing, I was lecturing and teaching on the importance of lifestyle and physical health, lifestyle and physical activity for mental health. Hundreds of students every year, undergraduate, postgraduate, talking about those for mental health. And yet I was struggling. I was burning out because I didn't see myself in the data. I didn't see myself in the literature as being somebody who was burning out. I didn't meet the kind of required definition. And in fact, that 2017, when I did seek some support and help, and I saw an occupational health doctor in the workplace, he looked me in the eye and he said, burnout doesn't exist. And of course I was like, what? I was furious, right? And he was right, because at that time it wasn't until 2019 the officially the WHO had not classified burnout as a syndrome. And so what he was trying to say is, well, I can't really put that down on the form, but I can sign you off. And that's quite, to not be seen, that was quite a heartbreaking thing, because then that becomes a stigma that I'm somehow failing and I'm not somehow coping with this role that I've worked so hard to achieve. So I think it's really important that we have to take a two-pronged approach. I think workplaces have a huge responsibility to make adjustments and to be really fair about what we're asking people to do, to treat people as human beings. But I think as individuals, we've got a lot to learn. And that's like, I try and do that through my own lived experience to go, okay, when I burnt out, I had to really learn and understand and have a healthier respect for what stress and burnout was. And that's what I try to do with the people I work with, because when we learn about how it shows up for ourselves and take a degree of responsibility to how we show up in the workplace, we have more room for that capacity. It's not always possible. And I like to just caveat to this point here, because, you know, the ability to manage stress is almost a privilege now. Some people haven't got time, financial resources, support socially to take a rest. It's all well and good me going, just have a rest, have a day off. Some people can't. And that's incredibly sad that we've got to that point where to make a living, people are having to stretch themselves to the point of, burnout, and it becomes normal to them. And I think so we've got to take, I think, a cultural, a broad sweep approach to how we manage this. Or I think it's going to, we see in Japan, people are dropping dead. And this isn't hyperbole, this is real data, that people are burning out, and young individuals having heart attacks in office blocks because of the stress that we're under. So it's terrifying. The World Health Organization call it the epidemic of the 21st century. That stress is the health epidemic of the 21st century. And again, I don't think that's hyperbole. I think they genuinely mean it. We have to take stock, I think.
So it sounds rather as if stress can creep up on us. I mean, you've mentioned depression, anxiety, and burnout. So is it usual that stress manifests itself in some other way, and before we tweak what's really going on?
Yeah, it's a great question, David. Yeah, it can do. So again, like most things, it's nuanced, and there's difference. It can depend, but for most people, the type of people I work with and see, if I was to define or classify my typical, burnt out candidate or client, they're typically high achieving, hard working, more or less type A or type 1 personality, who go out and pursue or seek challenge, hard work, and they enjoy that pursuit. They enjoy it, they get reward for it, they enjoy it to the point where they get away with a lot of the side effects of it, which is fatigue and tiredness, and they see the output as being worth the toil or the load. But the thing with the body is that level of demand, let's use the word demand instead of stress, it leaves a trail, in the sense that it costs energy. And so those systems within the body have been, when they've been exposed to that level of demand for long periods of time, means that the human being and the body is not getting sufficient recovery to basic cellular components. So we're talking about, again, we get really niche here, like really minuscule. We're talking about the powerhouses of the engines of the cells, which is called the mitochondria. So we start to see damage on a cellular level, which means that people start to feel tired, more fatigue. They may have damage to their insulin receptors in the muscles. They may have damage to their then circadian rhythm. And we see changes in endocrine changes over time, slow changes. So they may be their sex hormones, for example. Men, testosterone can be reduced in women. Estrogen and testosterone in women can be reduced. So we start to see these metabolic, endocrine, and neurological changes to the body. And they almost happen so slowly that we then maybe put them down to, again, in our 30s and 40s. We get away with it in our 20s and our 30s, where we might go, well, now I'm married, or now I've got kids, or now I've got a mortgage, or now I've got 2 jobs, or, we start to kind of make excuses, or I'm getting older, that aches, or I'm tired, or I'm staying out like partying. But eventually it gets to the point where the people I work with, and I experienced this myself, where we just feel broken, and no amount of trying to sleep, we can't even correct our sleep, or recovery, and we try to no amount of recovery or attempt to recover makes us feel better. And it's tied in with this detachment from the world. We're almost in this forced shutdown where the body, takes its own control back and slows down the nervous system. It slows down the metabolism, and it encourages us to stop and rest. And that can manifest as low mood, depression, anxiety. And so then we have this situation where this person is presenting with wide and varied symptoms, where they might pursue a diagnosis from the GP, and And of course, all those symptoms could be many things, and it take a long time to diagnose. For women, it can sometimes be put down to menstrual symptoms. It could be, and it is often a significant overlap with perimenopausal symptoms. So there's many things that it could be. So it can take quite a long time for people to receive a diagnosis of burnout, because where is that line? At what point do you cross chronic stress into burnout? It can be hard to decipher because it's almost like a process. So yes, it can creep up on people. The caveat again I would put into that is we're starting to see, and we need a lot more research on this, but we're starting to notice that for certain individuals. So specifically, I'm talking here the neurodivergent community, individuals who have ADHD or dyspraxia, dyslexia, or autistic, or even identify as any of those conditions and may not have a diagnosis. What we can tend to see is that they can burn out really quickly. So it can be the case that they're maybe experiencing stress, but they may have a stressful week. And it could mean they have burnout to the point where they spend the whole weekend in bed to recover, burnt out. And they may have a high profile job or really important role. They may be a teacher, a fireman, a police officer, and they shut down, and they miraculously on a Monday morning get themselves together and get up, put the mask on, front it up and go to work. And they can almost do that on repeat to the point where it's so exhausting that sometimes they then experience a full collapse. And we're seeing that more and more with late diagnosed neurodivergent people, where it can happen really, really quickly. And there's many, many other reasons, if you think about it, some potential reasons why that might be. And we know that potentially some of the reasons are there are neurological differences in neurodivergent people and how they tolerate stress. In fact, they're more likely to be bullied in the workplace. They're more likely to be exposed to stress from sensory points of view. So they're potentially more likely to be exposed to it, and therefore it's quite an intense experience, but they're having to show up and mask, and that in itself is quite stressful. So yes, it can be a long, slow burn, or it can be a quite intense, short burnout as well.
Thank you. So I was wondering, because you mentioned type A personalities and how they can carry quite a lot of stress, but I think you were suggesting that eventually there is a cost. So do you think that all stress is bad?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is something that I think is a very marketable question, because I think when I say marketable, I think it's easy for us to take the concept or the idea that there is something called good stress and then use it to either the advantage of an employer, the advantage of even a product or a service. And I'm talking about specifically here the exercise industry, that we can say exercise is good stress, or working hard and striving to get to the top is good stress, and don't be scared of stress. So let's get clear. So there is a concept or a theory that there's something called what we call eustress, EU stress. And, what that essentially means is that, well, like I talked about earlier, that when we experience a threat or a challenging situation, that the body will compensate in some way to help us to get away from that threat. And so potentially that is a good experience. So there is some positive, like stress shouldn't be demonized in that sense, because if we didn't have a stress response, we wouldn't be able to get out of that scenario, that situation. But when you look into the research of that, we can see that there's a limitation to that stress exposure. So when you look at research that has intentionally exposed people to good stress and then looked at their performance later on, what we tend to see is that they have a better what we call tolerance to new or novel stress. So if I was to expose you to a stressful situation over time, then your body would have a stress response. The brain would then say, okay, this person is exposed to quite a lot of stress. It would then down-regulate later on your response to a similar and also new or novel stressor, which means it's quite a nice adaptation. The brain goes, this person's exposed to quite a lot of stress. Okay, well, maybe we don't need so much adrenaline or so much cortisol. And the great example of that is in sports science, for example. So I always lend a lot to the literature in sports science, because if you think of an athlete, how an athlete gets fitter is they exercise or they train. And that, by definition, is a stressor, because what exercise does is it exposes us to something called hormetic stress, which is hormetic stress is any stress that affects our body temperature, our pH, and our energy systems. And so that hormetic stress tells the body that this body is under demand. And what does the brain do? It goes, that might happen again. And it therefore adapts in the future. So it would produce more red blood cells, more bone muscles, more bone cells, more muscle tissue, more red blood cells, more oxygen carrying cells, and make us bigger and stronger. So that hormetic stress has the potential to create this adaptation. Now, that is what we call, quote unquote, good stress. And there is potential for that to be really helpful for evolution, for growth. But it becomes, as I said, marketable. The popular culture, social media have jumped on that as a bandwagon and kind of gone, there is such thing as a good stress, and look at this. But like anything, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So if you even look at the literature for exercise, for example, we have what we call a J-shaped curve, which means in athletes, but also the general public, once we go beyond a certain amount of physical activity or exercise, we then go into the realms of increased morbidity and mortality, because now we're overexposing the body to over-exercise, overtraining, and that in itself has its own risks. So yes, stress has the potential to help us to grow and to adapt. But I think where in culture and in my role, what I have to try and be careful of is to try and help people to see that that's true, but we have to manage that process intentionally. So we can push people, but then we have to recover. We can push people, but we have to recover. And I guess I'm in many ways less of a stress management coach and more of a recovery coach, because my job is to take an individual to identify how much recovery they're getting, how close they are to burnout, and to help them to see the benefit and the worth of putting recovery back in, because when they put the recovery back in, then they can maybe take advantage of what we call good stress.
Right. That's brilliant. Can one protect oneself from stress?
I hope so. I'm trying to build a business off it. So, yeah. And I think, in science and in academia, we call it N equals 1, meaning the number of people in a study. So I am sort of N equals 1, one person, one case study. And then I could look at all of my clients as individual case studies. And one person's lived experience doesn't, of course, give us, broad sweeping generalizable data to say that, yes, for everybody can protect themselves against stress. But if we think about the biology of what we're doing here, and the psychology of what we're doing here is just let's go back to the basics. What is the point of the stress response? And what is the human body striving to do? It's simply trying to keep us alive. We mess it up by overexposing ourselves to lots of tempting things and work and culture and all these things, right? So if we go right back to basics and follow the laws of homeostasis and try to just facilitate that process the best we can, the body is happy and content. So the best way to protect ourselves against stress is to go back to the basics. And it sounds really uncool, unsexy, unmarketable, and too basic, but it's true. We need rest, we need sleep, we need daylight, we need movement, we need good food, we need social interaction, we need romantic relationships, we need creativity, we need spirituality. We need whatever is the ingredients that match our intentions as a human being. And if you look at, psychology, the word psychology, we might call it self-actualization. The closer we can get an individual to be aligned with how they feel happy, whatever that means to them, then the less degree of stress they'll experience. And that's very different for you, for me, for everybody I see. So whilst I might understand the psychology and the physiology of stress, every individual that comes in front of me, I'm trying to coach them to learn about themselves so they can teach me about them. They can learn about them themselves. And then we put the puzzle together. If you're like this and you need this, how do we now make your life fit into that? How do we kind of create this environment where, much like a gardener where the plant might go, well, that's in the wrong space in the garden. It likes more shade, right? Let's move it to that part of the garden and look, it thrives. So it's figuring out our needs. I think workplaces have a lot of responsibility to do that. I think we as individuals, I had to learn that the hard way. Who the hell am I? maybe I'm not an academic. Maybe this level of stress is not good for me. And actually, I work better as a self-employed entrepreneurial type who's got more control, comes back to control, and I can do what I want. I've got a young family, I can exercise, and I found my kind of sweet spot. So I think the best advice I give anyone to try and do that is to try and get close to who they are and match that. Again, it kind of is a privilege, because to think, to be able to do that for ourselves in this day and age is not always easy. And I understand that. I think it's not always easy for everybody to suddenly just meet their needs, but it can be done even in the smallest ways, and it can have significant improvement in our stress. It doesn't have to be a health spa. Closing your car door for an extra 5 minutes before you get out to go to the food shopping or pick your kids up from school. And something I do, I call it transitions. Before I move from one task to the next, I think about how I'm going to transition. Okay, I'm taking off my podcast hat to go and do the school run. Okay, I'm mum now. Okay, well, before that, I'm me. And in that moment, how can I let my nervous system regulate, take a breath, and just recover from whatever it is I was doing before I rush into the next thing? That doesn't cost me any money, but it can have a profound effect on my nervous system and my level of stress by the end of the day. And that's free to everybody, whatever race, color, creed, bank balance you've got. And it's just something I think is really powerful, simple, but really impactful.
Thank you. You mentioned a couple of strategies for keeping yourself in balance here, there. But what about if you're already very stressed, chronically stressed, say? What kind of strategies would you use then?
Yeah, I in that case, when somebody's chronically stressed, it can be challenging to work with those individuals, because, again, we go back to the biology here. When we're chronically stressed, we're not often thinking straight or rationally. We may just start to identify with the physiological symptoms. So usually those people are exhausted and they're tired and they're just sick of feeling that way, and they feel detached. They don't feel that themselves. So the hardest part of that is helping them to see that they need to rest, because their brain is in fight or flight, but I need to make more money, but I've got a long to-do list and I need to do more work. So they are very much driven by that fight or flight response, and they're not thinking about the longer term consequences. So when we're working with someone and if people are listening and they identify with being chronically stressed, I would urge them to really think about, those things can be managed in time, but the more recovery we can have, the more able and the more capacity we have to deal with that to-do list or to do those things. And so the fundamental thing that we need when we're stressed and burnt out, and around that point of burnout, is recovery. And that is really key. And recovery and rest don't necessarily mean lots of sleep, because actually, and conversely, lots of people struggle to sleep when they're burnt out. It's whatever it means to that individual that allows their nervous system to be in that kind of rest and digest parasympathetic state. So that might be gardening. That might be, well, I do a lot of thinking. I need rest. That's movement. So I'm going to go for a walk. So it's changing the way we view recovery, and think about, I need recovery from being a mom or a caregiver, and I need more connection with something else. So I would say for people is just to start to think about where they can fit moments of recovery into their day, and think about it from a cellular level. Is it a drink of water? Is it fresh air? What does it my body need? And go back to those basics, because the overwhelming big picture of the whatever it is, the work stress or the relationship stress or the life stress, that stuff is almost too big to process right now, and we have to give ourselves space. And when we come back online and we've got energy and we can think straight, then maybe therapy and talking therapy, and we're able to then process those thoughts rationally. We're able to challenge maybe some of those overwhelming catastrophic thoughts that we have, because actually perhaps they're not quite as bad as we thought, but when we're in burnout, they feel all consuming.
Thank you.
So, Bernie, how have you repurposed your academic knowledge to create a career outside research? You spoke about having an entrepreneurial streak to you.
Yeah. I think I'll never lose the academic mindset. I think the brain I have. I think what I try to do is remember that at the heart of everything I do as a coach and as a practitioner is I'm trying to educate and empower people. And so if you look at health psychology literature and research, what we know is when we give people control, it comes back to control, through understanding, so knowledge and awareness of what it is they're going through, that sense of volition and control increases their motivation, so their intrinsic motivation, but also their capacity and ability to change. And so really at the fundamental level, I'm an educator. And it's a hard sell sometimes to go into organizations because they want quick fixes, right? So quite often people are like, well, just give us 10 steps to burnout, or, what should they meditate, or should they? I'm like, well, yeah, these are all incredibly powerful things. But actually, what I see is it's more impactful if I can spend time and help someone to see that, oh, wow, look at this. When you do this, that changes this hormone and that links in with that. And look at how different you feel then. You can see their eyes kind of light up and start to think, oh, okay, that's why you're asking me to maybe not have caffeine at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah, because we're messing with your circadian rhythm. And if we mess with your circadian rhythm, you're going to struggle to recover. And if you struggle to recover, we're not going to get you out of burnout. If I try and say to them, right, we're going to go on a caffeine restricted approach, people who are burnt out want caffeine. So that's a really hard sell. So educating them and understanding the kind of the biochemical pathways behind the thinking behind the approaches I do is really important. So I think I always have to strike a balance, be careful. You might have found today, like I like to go into that science and that neuroscience. If you get your language right, it can be really empowering for people and break it down in chunks that helps them, because people want information and they like to understand. And so I think as an academic, I'll always do that. I'll always question the literature. I've worked with big brands around certain products, and I'm offered kind of practical products and biotech in relation to stress and burnout, sure you can imagine. And I'm always open-minded to it. But the academic in me and the researcher in me is like, where's your proof, where's your evidence? I try to be as evidence-based as possible, but knowing that, again, randomized control trials don't hold all the answers to, we can take all the evidence, but it might not apply to David or Naomi, right? You are different, because actually what I found, if you look at the literature, this is a big bugbear of mine. When you look in the literature, we don't have what we call ecological validity of the individuals I work with on a daily basis. So if you look at the trials and the research and the studies on burnout or even chronic stress, they're often in chronically stressed PTSD kind of communities or burnt out individuals, and that's fine. But when you look at the protocols of which they expose them to, let's say, for example, exercise, to look at the efficacy or the benefit of exercise in individuals who are burnt out, they are doing maybe short-term 6 to 12-week protocols. It might be a walking intervention. It may be some light weights or training or yoga. When I have a person sat in front of me on a call, they're potentially somebody who high-pressured, highly stressed environment. Let's say a police officer. So they're exposed to a lot of stress or trauma. They deal with stress by going for a run, marathon training, ultra marathon training. So they come on, they say to me, Bernadette, I'm really stressed, but you know what? I really have to do this training. And I'm like, okay, when are you doing it? 5 a.m. in the morning, because it's the only time I've got. Okay. What are you living on? Pure caffeine, fuel, like they have long shifts where they're not really able to fit in the food they need to support their training. So when you look at the research that supports and promotes, and I was guilty of this as an academic, exercise is good for mental health. And by the way, there's reams of research. It's indisputable that mental health can be improved by physical activity. But when we're thinking about someone who's doing a marathon or an ultra marathon, and we add that amount of physiological load and stress to life stress, it doesn't match, and it actually facilitates chronic stress and burnout. So the academic in me, that kind of lends me, I think it really helps me to see the bigger picture and to try and question, is actually that a suitable intervention for that individual, and join the science back up. And usually, it helps to adapt whatever approach I do with that individual then.
Thank you. Well, I think you've already told us what you think the impact of modern life is upon us and upon our levels of stress, particularly in relation to the work setting. And just now you touched upon academia and research. Do you think there are more areas to learn about stress in this area of work?
Yeah, I definitely think we have a lot to learn around exercise. as I've just touched on. We need more research studies on that. Again, I don't dispute the evidence to support physical activity, which means any movement in relation to, especially movement done outside. It boosts our immune system, it boosts our mental health, and it's really advantageous. But structured training, exercise that the fitness industry will push and promote and market and sell off the back of mental health benefits, which I think we've seen a huge shift in since lockdown. You know, it's very good now and easy to sell a Peloton bike or name any other brands, or, you know, a pair of trainers to say, you know, do this because it's going to improve your mental health, or exercise regimes. So I think we need valid research to support those claims. I'm not saying they're not correct, but the physiology, the biology behind it doesn't stack up, in my view, and the case studies I work with people. So that's one area. I think gender differences, we have to do a hell of a lot more. We know that biologically women are more likely to experience stress. Our brains process information differently, and the nervous system responds differently to stress. It makes us react more quickly to stress, but it also means that it sticks around longer. The male brain is more conditioned or more evolved to hunt and gather and to seek out stress, but it also processes stress quicker. So it metabolizes the stress response much quicker in many ways. So we need more research on that. And then off the back of that, women experiencing perimenopause, you know, when I work with women of, you know, early 40s, mid 40s, and women of my age group, and we see these symptoms, if you were to draw a Venn diagram, the overlap between chronic stress and perimenopause, they're almost, you know, it's a sweet spot, it's a perfect storm. And you think of that women in that part of their lives, we need more research around that, because, you know, maybe they've had a promotion or a relationship breakup, they've got teenagers or young children, there's gender differences and constraints within the workplace. There's so many things that women experience that is different. So I think we need a hell of a lot more research to help us, especially when it comes to hormone intervention, because, as I said, you know, stress is a biological, neurological response. So when then women are working with me and they're taking HRT, that has a huge impact on the nervous system, and we're seeing, you know, in a positive way, but also it causes lots of shifts. So we need more research on that. And I'd say the last group would definitely be, again, I've touched on it a few times today, but neurodivergent individuals, you know. And I think I was watching a podcast recently where somebody was being interviewed, and they were an ex-prison officer, and they were talking about the significant high rates of neurodivergent individuals in prison. And I think we have a lot of, you know, we know a lot more now about why that might be, and the course of the pathways that people arrive there. But, you know, from personal experience, but also working with people, I think we have a lot of responsibility to help people. You know, they're more likely, people with neurodivergence are more likely to be exposed to stress, bullying. They're more likely to be victims of crime. They're more likely to be involved in crime for reasons of, you know, seeking reward and excitement, and they're more likely to experience addiction. So we have to do a hell of a lot more research, because this is a new area. And I would say probably at least 50% of my client base are self-diagnosed or diagnosed with neurodivergence. And I think we need to do a lot more research in that field, across the board anyway, but definitely in stress. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bernie. That was so clear, so articulate. You make our job very easy. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome. Thank you. It's great. Any opportunity to talk about stress, as you now found, is great for me. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation, Bernie. Thanks for coming along.
No problem.